Hi, thanks for coming. Alexander Church, the city planner of Newburgh, is here to tell us how Newburgh transformed itself from a tired 1950s zoned nothing into a dynamic, exciting city of the future.
There we go.
No pressure.
Thank you, everyone. And thanks for having me. I'm always happy to talk about zoning. There are a few people that love zoning more than me. So my presentation is really focused on Newburgh. It's a very different city, but I'm going to go through some of the process that we did in updating our zoning in 2015. I have slides, but you are more than welcome. Please enter. I do this professionally, so if you have a question, raise your hand to ask it. I'm happy to do that, or we can do it at the end. So a little introduction for you, those of you that don't know Newburgh well. We are a very small city, especially small in area. We're only 3 square miles, which people don't generally know. When you think of the greater Newburgh area, most of it is not in this city. The highways are our boundary, 84 and the thruway. It's a city of 30,000 people. It is economically depressed, but it has a lot of great assets, especially being right on the Hudson, incredible views, but also an incredible amount of architecture. We did have a very large urban renewal program in the early 70s, but we still have hundreds and hundreds of exquisite architectural gems left in the city. Because of that, we've been seeing a lot of redevelopment, a lot of reinterest in the city. And so where I start is a program from PACE Land Use Law Center that happened in about 2012, and the yellow is not extra clear on this screen, so do let me know if you need something red, but we called it Streamlining. It was a program where PACE said there's all this interest coming into Newburgh. What are really the barriers to develop from a policy standpoint? And the kind of tenets of that was creating a clear and predictable path of development. So the idea that when a developer comes in, one of their greatest unknown costs is always the time and the path to development. They know how much the bricks will cost. They know how much the brick layer will cost. What they don't necessarily know is how long your process will cost them. One of the things that Newburgh didn't have was a single point of contact. So if you were a large or small developer coming in, you may run into the mayor on the street and he doesn't really know, and then you may run into someone else, and everyone knows different parts, but there's no real single point of contact to help you through this process. Our fees were at that point high compared to our surrounding towns. So one thing I always recommend when people are looking at rezoning is also look at your fees along with that. You want to make enough money to cover your costs, but you don't want to have things be outlandishly high versus your neighbors where developers may be choosing. And then it was taking a lot of time for people to navigate our land use boards. So because of those architectural gems, we have a zoning board like most municipalities. We have a planning board like most municipalities, but we also have a third board, which is for 2/3 of the buildings in our city, you're in a historic district, and so you have that historic district commission. And then for various reasons, you may have the waterfront board, you may have the Shade Tree Alliance, these different boards, and so it was becoming this process that was taking a long time. So we called that streamlining. The single point of contact, that was solved really easily. Each of these boards had a secretary and they were all being paid. And so we started phasing out all of those secretaries and hired one person. So you're asking how I have staff. One of those, so we have a single staff person now who is just the secretary to the land use boards. So when someone comes in for a zoning application, they also apply for their planning application, the same person. Just a little bit of a simplification, but it really making that single point of contact. We reduced a lot of our fees and transitioned them to escrow-based fees. And so what that means for those of you who aren't developers and aren't in the development world, for an easy project that doesn't require a lot of input, it may be a 1 or 2, a very generic 1 or 2 meeting kind of cycle, your fees are very low. But there are a lot of projects that come in that require long traffic studies and things like that. And we don't need to charge everyone for that. So those go into something called escrow. So the planning board sets that up, said we need to do a traffic study. We expect that to cost $10,000. That goes into escrow from the developer. So by shifting that, we're kind of evening out the kind of impact and the cost associated with those impacts across our fee structure. And then the big one at the bottom, reducing the time to navigate the land use boards. The easy one at the bottom in yellow is aligning the board schedule. So just taking a calendar and saying, a big one is if you need variances before you go to planning board, what if you have your zoning board meeting before your planning board? So therefore someone could theoretically go through a cycle in 1 month. But the big one that we're talking about tonight is actually reducing the needs for variances through zoning. And as my introduction said, Newburgh had we actually didn't have a 1950s zoning. We had 1980s zoning, which was worse. You at least are in Columbia County, which I have to say, I grew up in Orange County. Orange County is significantly worse in terms of kind of the 1980s psyche of what zoning should be there. Very, 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 very suburban. On most of the lots we deal with are 2,500 square foot lots. If you're with 25-foot setbacks, this doesn't work. It just wasn't done at all reasonably for the built environment that was there. So what was happening was someone bought a house, right? Wanted to do a minor something, maybe add a unit, subtract a unit. That was a change of use. They couldn't meet the setbacks because it was ridiculous. They could never meet the setbacks. We were sending everyone to zoning board. So again, a recommendation of the first step is always to kind of look at what most of your variances are now. The variances should be outliers. You should be doing those not every time. If for every type of application they have to go to the zoning board, there needs to be a change in the zoning. And so this was an extremely long process for a lot of reasons, which I will get into in a minute, but effective September 1st, 2015, we have, the city of Newburgh has a new, completely new zoning. So this was a zoning rewrite. It was not an update. We really did blow up what was there and start over. And some of I will go into a lot more specifics, but one of the big changes is, so this line here is just about the boundary of the kind of the old city and the new city, the historic district and the kind of 1950s, 60s, and 70s, single-family development on the side. And so for all of this is the downtown. We used a lot of this, what are called form-based districts. I'll get into that a little more, but we have what's a blended model. So out on the west end, anyone who knows about zoning and land use colors, we have an industrial park, right? So that's purple. That's something that you keep and continues. We have lots of this light yellow throughout the city, and those are just general single-family. Ours is called low-density residential. We did make some updates to that, which I will get to in a minute. But still there. We didn't blow up the whole idea of zoning. Some communities do. Saratoga, for example, did entirely redo their zoning for form-based code. We did keep these traditional code zones. The orange is just general commercial. You could build a strip mall there. Again, still keeping that. But it's this east end area that we really made a lot of changes to. And one thing that I do want to add is we're now in 2019, and we did write in this code that we would look every 3 to 4 years to update it, and we are now updating it. So don't think that, which I think my predecessor, who spent a huge amount of energy rewriting the zoning, she kind of was like, we did it, we're done, we're never touching zoning again. You do have to go back. There were errors, which is always going to happen. It's always going to be literally mistakes. But then there are also things that just weren't working that we're now adjusting as we're moving forward. So there are two parts to zoning. There are uses and there are area. Zoning is a set of rules that governs all of the uses that you're allowed to have on your property, and then all of the area requirements that you have to meet as well. So that's what we call setbacks. That's also where we talk about parking and parking requirements. So to start with, the updated uses to reduce the number of use variances that were required. The idea was to look at the entire city comprehensively and say, what kind of businesses are people having now, and what do we expect them to have in the future, and how can we make it fit? And so that when someone comes in, we can often just say, it's permitted by right, go get your building permit. And so we have a lot more uses in general, a lot more uses permitted by right or permitted with only site plan review. There were a lot of special use permits before, and we've taken a lot of those out. The uses are generally consistent with the zone. I'll get into that again with the form-based codes. The idea that downtown uses should be downtown, that was not the case before. And then we have this thing at the end here, which is to really try to, in practice has been harder than we had hoped, but a change within a category with no area change is not a change of use. So theoretically, and this has not worked perfectly, if you were changing from a 2-family to a 3-family, so that's a change in the residential code, it would not be considered a change of use. You wouldn't have to meet any of the board requirements, just go right to the building department. That's been much harder to implement than we thought, and so that's actually one of the big updates. I shortened it a little bit, but that's kind of the wording that's currently in our code. And one of our big parts of our rewrite or our update now is to just define for each of those. So specifically, if you're going from a 1 to a 2 or a 2 to a 3, that will not be considered an update. So that's just, but again, it should make the process faster, but also more predictable. So I've listed them out. I know that this is the chart literally in our zoning book, but here are the residential uses, and I want to call out specifically 3 that we found great success with. So one is accessory apartment, also in our definitions, in-law apartment, this is also called. The idea is on that west end where you have lots of single family homes, there was a big pushback in public meetings that I want my neighborhood to be a single family neighborhood. The houses were built that way, they support that. But to add affordable housing and also to kind of support how people's lives change a little bit, we have this use called accessory apartment, and the idea this is sometimes in a walkout basement, sometimes above a garage, and that you can add a secondary apartment. It's very clear in our code, in the implementation of our code, that has to be managed by the person living there. So you can't have a landlord come in and say, I have 2 units now. It's not that. It's accessory to the single family use. But adding another unit, either to make ends meet, so you can rent that out, again, or a teenager or another relative. An obvious one, but one that's not in a lot of old codes, is mixed use with residential. So remember, if you don't know why we have zoning, zoning is the idea that certain uses are in conflict with other uses and would create a nuisance that would reduce the property value of the neighbor, right? So if I opened a power plant directly next door to someone's house, I'm creating, or we're in Hudson, so how about a cement plant, right? Directly next door to someone's house, the cement plant or the power plant is, even though it's operating on its own land, it's not creeping on to the other person's land, it's actually reducing their property values. It's creating a nuisance, therefore it's having a direct impact on the neighbor, and that's why we're allowed to zone through lots of case law. So the idea with that is that each parcel will have a use. And then as we get to kind of the 1990s and a lot of new urbanism, and we start to do this kind of planner look back at what's working and not working in communities, one of the things we realize in successful communities that's working is kind of the historic model of mixed use with residential, right? This works on Warren Street, this works on many, many main streets. The shop is on the first floor and there are apartments upstairs. That idea on its face is contrary to zoning as it was done for many, many years. Many zoning codes don't allow something like that we all think that makes a lot of sense. So just adding this thing, mixed use with residential as a specific use, took a lot of the pain from the building department and going through the land use processes. In all of our downtown zones and in most of the city, under different rules, but that is allowed now, and just having that can be very transformative. And then another one at the bottom, which at the time when we did this in 2015, we thought everyone was going to want, this was the thing that everyone was moving for, is live work. And that's the idea that you can live and work in exactly the same space. So a room like this, my bed's over there, there's a efficiency kitchen there, and my artist studio is here, or whatever my production is here. We had heard in Newburgh, we have a lot of old industrial buildings, that's what everyone wanted, that's what everyone was moving towards. We actually, in practice, most developers, when given the option, would rather separate, and then we say fire separate, make a separate unit between the living and workspaces. And so it's actually a lot more, having this mixed use with residential is much more popular than those live work units that we thought everyone wanted. So these are institutional uses. There's nothing really transformative here, other than to remember, I always remind people, a lot of these uses, especially the houses of worship, you have to allow for, and you have to allow in most zones. There is lots of case law that you cannot zone out. In a city like Newburgh especially, we have lots of churches, lots of nonprofit institutions. You cannot legally zone them out. So always remember that. But one we did add is something called community parking lot. This is idea, and it's very clearly defined. If you want to, at the end, I will give you the link to our code, and you can look it up. But community parking lot is the idea that there may be an empty lot on your block, and you may not have a driveway. Especially in Newburgh, we have big rows of row houses, and people may not have a driveway. People can get together and share and have a it's not for income based, but it's for a community to share a lot. We did, though, with that, there are very, very, very strict, any new parking lots have to have very strict landscaping and things like that. So it doesn't, we're not talking about just a gravel park your car kind of space. Commercial uses, again, expanding the kind of uses that we have, making sure that we've gotten most of the kind of modern uses. But I specifically want to talk about, I'll do actually a couple more than the ones I've highlighted in red. I'm going to do cottage industry last. Restaurant, we just kind of chomp down to these three. Fast food, the reason we call out fast food is specifically, and you can see it in our code, that's the addition of the drive-through. So we don't really, if it's not a drive-through, it may be branded and be the carry-out, but that's our difference here. Carry-out, we've separated, but restaurant is just very big and vague. It's very hard for people in my position, but especially a building inspector, to sit there and say, is this a cafe? Is this a coffee shop? And it's also hard, though, for the restaurateur who opens a coffee shop, but then starts serving sandwiches. But now, that's not a zone change. It's a restaurant, let's make it a restaurant on day one, and they can kind of be flexible in there. With a similar vein, retail and then neighborhood scales retail. For a landlord, you build a retail space. What they're selling in that, they're gonna have their tenants change. Let's not get in the way, and every time they have a different kind of retail, we're going to make them come back to the city. But we did make a different scale, and the idea between the two of these is retail neighborhood, which we specifically list the types of this is things like a dry cleaner, a laundromat. If I can go back to the map really quickly, we've added at some of these intersections within neighborhoods, where there may be 4 or 5 buildings right at the intersection, right at the crossroads in the center of neighborhoods. We don't want the largest scale retail, but they're very well suited for kind of the smallest neighborhood scaled one. Again, something like the laundromat that goes there. So we've kind of broken it out, wrong way, only that way. So kind of big general categories, but kind of expanding as far as we can go. So the big one I want to talk about, so I was saying live work before, and and most developers have decided to eschew live work instead for mixed use with residential. When someone declares mixed use with residential as a use, we say, okay, so it's mixed use with residential, they want 4 apartments, and then we make them also declare what the commercial use will be. And when we're talking about a lot of these, they choose something called cottage industry. In cottage industry, the way that we've defined it is, again, the word nuisance, because that's what allows us to do zoning, is a scale of manufacturing where the nuisance never leaves the unit. And we don't care what you're making in there, and as long as the smells, the sounds, the vibrations don't leave the unit. Sometimes a unit is an entire building, and so that's easier to control. In a lot of our kind of redone industrial buildings that are now kind of what we call artist studios, those are small units. You know, they may be 300 square feet, and so those property owners have to really insulate, soundproof each of those. But once you are in those spaces, what you are producing, the city does not care. And the best example I have, my very dearest friend, she does not live in Newburgh, she lives in Brooklyn, but she is a ceramicist. And she went to school for sculpture, and she was sculpting, and then realized she actually loved working in clay, and now she's a production ceramicist. The idea is that what we call an artist studio transitions into someone who's actually doing manufacturing, often really quickly and really, really easily. And that the city actually doesn't care that Natalie is not sculpting anymore and is now making production ceramics. What we are concerned about is that unit is safe, it's fire safe, and that it's not impacting the neighbors. And so this use alone has launched huge amounts of small businesses in Newburgh. Everything, a lot of furniture makers, cabinet makers, and it really can fit in almost anywhere. This can fit in a garage. You can have cottage industry as an accessory use. Remember that you have to be living in that house, but then that you can do things in your garage, all of those uses. And so it's allowed businesses to start up and most importantly to grow in Newburgh, because you can transition from your garage or a really small studio into a larger production space. And then, of course, we also have industrial uses. The one that you guys also on the Hudson, remember to add some of the waterfront uses, industrial uses, because they exist and they can be very important to the kind of, Hudson River lifestyle that people are used to. You have an updated LWRP, I think, and that'll call out a lot of the waterfront industrial uses too. So Newburgh, like many other Hudson River towns, is transitioning to a less industrial waterfront, but I would add, make some of those allowed so that you can still have some of those legacy businesses continue. Okay, so we've now talked about the uses, and of course the other idea is the area, that is the other half of zoning. And so the idea is to allow the uses to continue, but then also you don't want everyone to be going to the zoning board for minor adjustments, especially in what we call as-built. So if you have a building that was built in 1850, you're certainly not going to make them move their walls so that they have a larger side yard. But often they have to go to the zoning board because you need a side yard in these neighborhoods. So making that work. And the big way we did do, generally in the traditional zones, we greatly changed the bulk regulations to really match kind of, it's a little bit of a game because you're matching the average of what's there. You're never going to hit everyone. And greatly reduce the parking requirements. Newburgh as a community would not, we tried, let us remove parking requirements. Buffalo is the big, kind of sister community in New York State that's under the same rules. They did remove all of their parking requirements. I tried a lot of different ways. In no way was Newburgh having that. We certainly still have parking requirements in the traditional zones. But again, they're greatly reduced. And they are the majority of our variances at this point. Someone, again, wants to go from a 2-family to a 3-family, they need to get a variance for those parking spaces. And it's not terrible. I mean, I sit in these meetings. It's not terrible. The community comes out sometimes and not others, which I think is, kind of says that it's working. So when an entire neighborhood comes out and says there's not enough parking in our neighborhood, the board looks a little differently than when no one comes out. But it is frustrating kind of from a planner perspective. Just for those of you that aren't planners, the reason that you would reduce parking variances is for a couple of reasons, reduce parking requirements is for a couple of reasons. One, there's a general idea, in most places, if you did an inventory of all the parking in the city, especially Newburgh, again, 3 square miles, there's enough parking overall. It's just that people want to park right out front. So by reducing the requirements on any individual property, you're forcing people to look at a broader picture. But then the other half of that is that developers often, when you have a big development come in, they will know whether what kind of parking their type of units will require, and so they'll kind of build it. By the city governing it, we're just forcing it in locations that it's not really needed all the time. So you see a lot of half-empty parking lots in new developments because they weren't necessarily needed. And in historic cities, it can often mean tearing down buildings too. That's a lot of ways that developers try to make this work. But what I really want to talk about are form-based districts. And so these are our 4 form-based districts. All of Broadway, which is our main street, is one form-based district. This yellow is called downtown neighborhood. That's the center of our historic district. The blue is our waterfront, which is kind of, at this point, half developed, but we created this to have a lot more density if it wants. And then this red here is actually our urban renewal land. It's completely undeveloped. And I think I'll do this one. And so the idea was to create a zone that would allow developers to come in and build exactly what the city had already decided from its master plan, from a lot of charrette work, we wanted that to look like at the density and the scale. So generally what form-based zoning is it allows a lot of uses, almost all uses are allowed, but what it governs is actually the form. And so we have what the building is going to look like, how tall it is, how wide it is, how it sits on the lot. There are, not just like in traditional zoning where you have maximums, so you can't build taller than 5 stories, for example. In form-based districts, we have minimums, so you can't build a single-story McDonald's. You have to meet minimums. You have to, in the historic, the downtown neighborhood, the historic district, for example, you have to have 80% frontage. So 80% of the front of your building 80% of your lot has to continue along the front because you want to continue that kind of historic quarters downtown. You don't want big gaping parking lots, for example. In these zones, parking has been greatly reduced, parking requirements. For 4 units or less residential uses, there is no parking requirement. There is no parking requirements on all of Broadway. There's lots of parking already in parking lots, and so there are no minimums there. And for commercial uses, the first 2,500 square feet of a commercial use is discounted. So you don't have to provide parking for the first 2,500 square feet. So for many buildings and businesses, they don't have to build parking. Form-based zoning is funny mostly to people because this is what it looks like. Literally, if you open our zoning, this is what the form-based district looks like. It is not in legalese. It does not look like a code. This is literally it. We have pictures. We have examples of the type of form, of the type of buildings that typify the neighborhood now or typify somewhere else and that we want to recreate it here. So civic buildings, kind of large scale in this zone. Here you see a residential street, commercial street in the downtown neighborhood. And if you're trying to, especially with historic neighborhoods, especially with mixed-use neighborhoods, if you're trying to maintain that form, and something like Orange Street, if your ultimate goal, you don't care what the first floor business becomes, it's something, but you're worried that people are going to tear down and build things that are anachronistic to that neighborhood, and you don't necessarily have controls from something like a historic district. Form-based zoning is a very interesting way to go. It can be, you don't necessarily get to say it has to be historic looking or it has to be modern looking. You know, there is a lot of flexibility in kind of the style of that, but you can control a lot of different kinds of architectural style this way. That said, you often have architects write form-based code, and so that's why you get a little bit of that. This is another page in our form-based zoning. So where generally you would have what we call a bulk table that says your setbacks. Instead, this is what a bulk table looks like in our form-based code. We're saying how the building needs to sit on the lot, right? So here's a really good example. In a traditional zoning, you would say these are two residential buildings and the developer would center each of them on the center of the lot to have the least amount of variances. That doesn't work in a typical urban area. We would love to have party walls because that's what was historically built here. So here you can see that the idea is, the preference is to shift them to the one property line, and that's, so you don't have these really static bulk regulations. These are height, this is a height requirement. And the light gray is the minimum, and the adding on to that is the maximum. So the idea for this one, I know you can't really see it, but this is for row houses, for residential row houses. In the downtown neighborhood zone, they must be at least 2 stories, and we don't want them more than 4 stories. These are called shop front or mid-rise in that same zone. We want those to be at least 3 stories. And a maximum 5 stories, or you can have the 6th story with the setback. So it feels, and this was done by surveying the streets, literally walking down certain main streets and saying, okay, well that building's really tall, but it looks great and it doesn't overpower everything. So that's what our maximum height's gonna be. And that's what a lot of our zoning group did, is that they walked around these different neighborhoods taking pictures, which leads to a lot of these photos of kind of good examples. And then you can also throw things in there too. This is a sheet that I threw in for sign types. So it's based on the type of storefront you have, the different kind of sign types that we prefer. Again, this is something that the planning board manages. This is done in the site plan review. This is not done by an architectural or style committee. This is not a separate board. This is done during the site plan process. The same time they're telling you where their sewer line is going to go, they're also meeting this. And I think I'll do that, go back to those in a second. But the idea, I mean, we've had great feedback from developers once they wrap their head around it. And so the first bit is completely like, I don't understand this at all. And then you say, no, you actually do. This is, we just want you to build things similar to this, similar to what's there. And so that kind of lead in is a little hard. We often say, we know you generally bring your engineer to planning board, but you may want to bring your architect in early. That's a good, architects again tend to understand this a little more. And once you let them know what you're having, when you build this structure, again, we really don't care who your first floor tenant is. It completely, they start to understand, you know, we've taken away that parking, we don't care who your first floor tenant is. It all makes a little more sense as they go through the process. So then I'm going to wrap up with just some case studies. So to start with, this is a street view because I didn't, of course, you never take the before picture. And the building's actually finished now, but I also haven't updated it. But this is a building, this is Liberty Street, which is our kind of smaller main street that has a lot of shops and restaurants now at the intersection of Broadway. So this is not the center of the city, but it's kind of the center of commercial life in the city. And this was a terrible, terrible building where someone in a very Newburgh story in the middle of the night, because the historic district wouldn't give him permission, he ripped the facade of the building off. And so for many years, this sat with no facade and no 3rd floor. And so this developer actually chose, he knew we were rewriting the zoning, and he had his architect read code, and he said, I'm going to hold off on my approvals. So he put everything on hold for 3 months because he knew in the old zoning on Broadway, which is, again, Broadway is every single building at one time was 1st floor residential, or 1st floor commercial, upstairs residential, or it was where a lot of the theaters, kind of the big civic buildings were. Residential as a use was not allowed at all. And therefore, mixed use was also not allowed at all. Mixed use was not allowed anywhere, but residential as a use was not allowed. And the first floor of this building, he swears he's opening in April. I don't understand how, but as a restaurant, and he actually has more seats now. I should update this to make this. But we required 1 parking space per 3 seats. And so for 50 seats, that was 17 parking spaces on Broadway with a municipal lot half a block away and another municipal block, another block away. He could have never made this work. He would never have been able to open the restaurant here. The new zoning, he didn't have to actually go to any boards. Mixed use was allowed by right, restaurant was allowed by right, and there's no parking requirements in the Broadway corridor zone. He actually owns a lot nearby and wants to have parking because he believes that he needs, for the type of restaurant that he's having, that he needs to have parking. But this gives him enough time. He can stabilize a lot later. He can do, he can invest in the building and worry about that later. So that's my use case study. This is an area case study about area variances. This was actually not, this neighborhood was built by, there are 2 Habitat for Humanity neighborhoods. This, it's called East Parmenter Street. It's in the downtown neighborhood, which is another form-based district, and with residential a lot of, I guess it was probably 70% residential new construction. This project was as the historically African American community, especially. This is right off of, where I'm standing to take this picture. Behind me is Washington's headquarters, and so the estate that Washington's headquarters was on supported a huge African American community. They were living in until a lot of these were burned out when Habitat came in, but they're 2-story wood frame buildings, and they just were in rows. And many, many, many of them were in too bad shape to redo. There's a couple that were redone, probably 3 or 4 on that block. Under the old zoning, though, which was very, very, very suburban, there were 126 discrete area variances required. Mixed use was not allowed. They really wanted to have some mixed use buildings, to have some shops and things on it, and they just couldn't. And there were these weird agreements that took place because they wanted some of these buildings to be row houses. It's easier, it's faster, it's cheaper to build, but it's also what was there. They were literally tearing down buildings and replacing new construction on the same footprint was their goal. And they needed 126 area variances. There were these agreements, though, with side yards, that you had to have side yards, and we had to have side yards somewhere. So there's these weird alleyways that go to nowhere. They just kind of forced things in because they got tired of getting area variances. The block 1 over is now done in these much, they're complete too. I've got to update this presentation, but same development, same habitat, they have the same parameters. I don't know if you guys have a strong habitat, but they have very, very strict parameters of how expensive a building can be because they want to keep it affordable for their property owners. 2 years later, under the new zoning, mixed use is allowed by right, so they're able to have these live-work spaces. Live-work is allowed by right, and so this was one of the first to come in and say, we want to do live-work, and we said, are you sure, are you sure, are you sure? And they said, no, actually, we want this thing called mixed use with residential. So they're individual units. This is 1 unit upstairs for the family, and this is a business unit for the family. They're all built with the intention that the family upstairs will run the business downstairs, but by having it this mixed use with residential, if for some reason their business fails, they can rent out that space too. It's not connected. And that whole project required no variances. Same as the previous one, no area variances, no use variances. They all meet, they touch each other, and the parking is dealt with in the neighborhood. So that's the end of my formal presentation. This is my contact. Our code is online, so you can copy down the numbers. I think you guys use eCode too, but obviously the fastest way to use eCode is just to Google search eCode Newburgh, and then you'll get up our zoning code, which is the last chapter. And I welcome any questions, clarifications, let me know. Thanks.
So my question is, you said it took a long time, and I think I know what that time is, and you also told me a dollar amount. Could you share this?
Yeah, I don't remember the dollar amount. So the long time was almost 4 years, and the reason that took so long was it started with it didn't start within the city. It started with something called the Greater Newburgh Partnership. It was a coalition of our institutions, especially the hospitals and the colleges. They were the big payers into this Greater Newburgh Partnership. And they coalesced a group around the rezoning. They believed that streamlining, which is what I started with, and rezoning was what the city needed to do. And that became very contentious with the city. The city didn't feel like there was enough input. The planning board and the zoning board didn't feel like there was enough input. And that fell apart. They paid a contractor close to, the agreed upon price was close to $200,000 to do the whole zoning redo. I honestly don't know, it was not the city, I don't know how much of that they got paid, but I know that they didn't get paid everything. Because when I was brought in as the planner, we were there to kind of save this sinking ship. So much energy and work had gone into this. We were so close. We had read drafts. So we, on our own, went back to the kind of benevolent business owners and said, what can you give us? We got something like $40,000 together and called the consultant and said, can we buy it off of you for $40,000? And that was enough to settle what they had thought they had done. We got a very, very, very complete draft, but there was a lot of work to do. So then we went back to what I think is a better starting point, to our planning and zoning board and kind of our community of educated people, and said, help us finish this. And that's where we kind of ground truthed a lot of things. Like I said, we walked around neighborhoods to look at heights, added things at that point that we thought was more progressive. And looked at a lot of that, and ultimately got it passed with a lot of community meetings, a lot of negative comments at community meetings. The day that we had to go before council, we were all shaking, and for whatever reason that day, our council is crazy, but then I hear every council is crazy, so that day they were angry at the police chief and had no idea. So then I came screaming at the police chief about something, and came to vote, and it was unanimous. No one had a comment. They just voted unanimously, approved it. We were shell-shocked. The police chief literally hugged me and said, if I can get beaten up to get zoning done, it's the best day, so and these things, how they work, I think, I think people knew that it needed to be done, and they just were kind of tired. Maybe we bored them with our planning, but yeah, it took a lot of energy, with a lot of committed volunteers. It was a lot of work, but we